Hello and welcome back to Living the Reno and another episode of our kitchen renovation series. Today we're going to be installing a subway tile backsplash. If you're wondering why I'm standing here with no cupboard doors, that's because last episode we installed the upper trim on these cabinets, so just waiting for the paint to dry that one. That's why there's no more doors on here. After doing some research and watching a bunch of other YouTube videos, there's a couple things that I'm going to check before we start slapping these tiles on the wall. So the first thing I did was set up this laser level and check the height of the countertops to make sure that they're basically all level with each other. My biggest concern was the two sides of the stove. Thankfully, it's basically all flat within maybe like a 1/16 of an inch, so I think we're fine. My concern was if this was like, let's say lower, then you'd run the tile flat across and then you'd be left with a gap underneath that you'd have to fill with some weird little tile. So thankfully this was actually all installed pretty level, so we're good to go there. The next thing I did was run a vertical line across all of these areas. So in this case, we're gonna be running the tile from the left side to the right, which is gonna end up in that corner. And then we're gonna start from there and wanna work our way back into that corner. So if there's any funny cuts, it'll kind of be hidden in that back corner. These two casings are level, that piece is level, this one is not. So if you can kind of see the laser line there, it's touching at the top, but then there's a gap at the bottom. So what I did here was I put a tile at the top where it's the furthest out, and I made a mark and then drew a level line all the way down. So the first tile is going to start at this line, and there's going to be a slight gap on this side, and then as it goes up, that gap will get smaller and smaller. It'll get filled with grout, and then I'm going to put some sealant around there as well, so you won't even notice there's a gap when it's done. But that way, once I get this line across and I start coming across here, it's not going to interfere with our brick pattern. This will be the brick pattern we're going for, so there'll be a half tile here, that'll go on to the corner, a full tile, and then there'll be another half tile here to create that offset brick pattern. So then I measured from the countertop to the upper cabinet, which ended up being 18.75 inches or 18 3/4, which would, if you put a full tile at the bottom and then got to the top, it would end up with a small sliver. So dividing it up equally plus the grout line is 1 1/16 of an inch. So we end up with about 1.75 or 1 3/4 inch tile at the bottom, and then we're gonna end up with about the same at the top. So to start our rows, we're gonna have to basically rip down a whole bunch of tile to start and then cut a bunch in half, and then that will get our starting row done, and then we'll be able to go up, and then once we get to the top, we'll recheck that measurement, but it should be about the same as the bottom. And here's all the tools and materials we're gonna use to install it. We have our tile adhesive, our tile trowel with a 1/4 inch notch, we have our tile spacers, and then to cut the tiles, we're gonna be using that 14-inch tile cutter. This is a diamond blade for a angle grinder. And then we have our grout, pre-mixed grout, and our float, and our grout sponge. I've ensured that the power is off, so I'm gonna take off all these wall covers, pull out all these receptacles and all of these switches, and that way we can get the tile behind it. I'm gonna put something on top of these countertops so we don't make a mess of them. Now we're gonna cut up a bunch of tile so we can get our first row started, and then we'll start getting these on the wall. These simple tile cutters work really well at making straight cuts and are incredibly fast. Also, never having used one of these before, I can say they are pretty quick to figure out. Basically, you line the tile up with the scoring wheel, slide the wheel along the top of the tile, and then use the breaker to snap it. I found using the trowel to get the adhesive out of the bucket and onto the wall a little difficult, so I ended up using a plastic putty knife, and I just used the trowel to make the grooves, and that seemed to work the best for me. Getting the tiles on the wall was quite a simple and enjoyable task, but making the cuts around the electrical and window casings with the angle grinder was the most challenging part. I will explain more about that shortly. The camera died last night, but we did make it all the way into that corner. There was a couple things that I learned from this process and a few mistakes that were made, so let me show you. First one was this cut right here, which was the first cut that I did, and I should have just notched it with the angle grinder so it was a little closer to the box, because now unfortunately the top of this plug will actually go behind the backsplash, so I'm gonna have to put some spacers in this screw to keep it actually sitting flush with the top of this tile, whereas on this one, in this corner here, I cut the tile just around where the screw hole goes on both the top and the bottom, just enough to get the screw in there. So now this plug will actually sit flush with the tile, and that makes it a lot easier. So for the next plugs, I'm gonna do the same thing. The other thing I will mention is that if you have access to a wet saw, like a wet tile saw, whether you rent or you buy like a cheap one, I would highly recommend it. The angle grinder is kind of a pain, and I was breaking a lot of pieces last night, and I was kind of cursing while the mortar was setting, and I was trying to figure it out. I did come up with a solution that helps mitigate some of the breakage on the tile, so I'll show you that the next time I cut something, but just, be warned, if you're considering doing this with or without the tile saw, I would do it with the tile saw. Here's the system that I came up with. I use this C-clamp here and 2 pieces of scrap wood, and that way this keeps the tile completely steady, because what I was finding was the tile was shaking as I was grinding it, and then it was prone to cracking. I had the C-clamp on here with just some cardboard, and it kept cracking the tile by the pressure that the clamp created, and the vibration was loosening it. So this way I can tighten it really hard. It's gonna hold the tile in place. The stick is also long enough that I can put my leg on it and lean on this whole thing, so that way this is completely stationary, and then I'm just gonna slowly chip away at this piece here. I purposely started on the smaller of the 2 walls, that way I could get practice actually cutting the tile, installing it, spreading the adhesive, all that kind of stuff, before I went onto the big wall. So now this is the largest section, which goes all the way across the stove here and the range hood. So we're gonna pull out the stove, pull out the cover plates, pull out the plugs, all that stuff, and we're gonna start laying tile across here. I took the tiles 1 row down behind the stove, and I used a scrap piece of wood to hold the tiles here from sliding down until the adhesive had time to dry. The second wall went much faster than the first. The more I did, the easier and quicker it became. Before I put in the grout, I went around and I cleaned off all the tiles, making sure that there was no adhesive left on the surface, and I used a small metal punch to clean up some of the grout lines. The grout experience was surprisingly challenging. This was probably due to the type of grout and/or the fact that it was pre-mixed, but for whatever reason the mix was very dry and incredibly hard to apply, and it also cured really quickly. I found I had to apply a very small section and almost immediately clean it off with a sponge. And even after that, I spent a while cleaning up the grout lines with a cleaning sponge. I am thinking the next time I will use a grout that requires mixing so that I can get the correct consistency. The pre-mixed adhesive worked great though. I would like to know if any of you have done grouting before, and what was your experience like, and what type did you use? Let us know in the comments below. After all the tile was in, I noticed the gap at the top row underneath the cabinets was easily seen when sitting at the dining room table. So I cut up some leftover baseboard and I painted it to match the cabinets and installed it with some brad nails. The last step was sealing all the edges with a silicone sealant. I find using painter's tape ensures you end up with nice crisp lines and it keeps things tidy. After applying, I dipped my finger in water and I smoothed out the silicone. To ensure that the silicone did not stick to the tape, I removed it as soon as I finished smoothing it out. backsplash is done and installed and everything looks great. That means there's only one more thing left to do in this kitchen, and that's to install a drawer underneath our farmhouse sink. So stay tuned for that episode.